transport by 2050. And then somebody sent some printing to my printer, which sits next to me, so sorry about that. So I'm Greg Marsden, I'm the director of DecarboN8, which is a place-based decarbonisation research network. We're working with local authorities, Transport for the North, universities and businesses to try and look at how we understand how to meet the challenge of decarbonisation, recognising that it has to happen everywhere and that places are quite different from each other. So it's not as easy to decarbonise in different places in the same way. It won't cost the same everywhere, and the pathways and the speed of transition might be quite different in different places. So that's the kind of focus of the DecarboN8 network, and we're organised into various research themes. I'm delighted that Professor Phil Blythe from the University of Newcastle, who is the Chief Scientific Advisor at the Department for Transport, but he's also the head of our one of our research themes, recently taken that role on, which is looking at the role of fuels and fueling of vehicles as part of our research network. So this webinar is part of a series of webinars where we're trying to open up the different aspects of thinking about the technology supply side of things to connect vehicles of all sorts across networks, and just how, understanding in particular for DecarboN8 what the place-based questions are there. But clearly this is also something where what happens at a local level matters to what happens at regional and national level. So the connectivity between national and local strategies is really, really important and interesting. So delighted to have Phil here. He's going to talk about where we are with the Transport Decarbonisation Plan process. He's going to talk about the research and innovation gaps, which in particular he's responsible for driving forward the science agenda in the DFT, and trying to make that connection between practice and what needs to come next. And he's also going to give some reflections on the current context with COVID-19 and what that opens up and what that makes more difficult, which I think is a really important discussion to have. In terms of some housekeeping, if you've just joined, please put your name and affiliation in the chat box. We're going to be recording the presentation and we'll make that available on our YouTube channel. We won't be recording the Q&A part of the discussion. For the Q&A, please put your questions in the chat box. I'll be monitoring that, so you can put them in at any point during the presentation, as well as when we get to the Q&A discussion. I will probably end up clustering some of those. We'll try and get through as many of them as they can, but that will be a kind of a discussion between myself and Phil where I'm using your resources. So have that discussion and conversation. Feel free to answer each other's questions in the chat box, share links. I think all that sort of stuff helps us to learn from these kinds of webinars. In the event of a fire, that's an entirely local problem to you, so I presume you'll sort that out. Okay, so I'm going to hand over at this point to Phil. I'll turn my camera and mic off, and we'll look forward. I think it's about 40-45 minutes you're going to talk for, Phil?
Yeah, about that.
Great.
See how it goes.
Thanks a lot, Phil.
Okay. Okay, good to be here, everybody. Thank you for joining me today. I'd like to talk about the thinking we have in the department around the decarbonisation agenda, which is big and really complex. And as Greg says, there's a need for some thinking at the national level to achieve this, but clearly a lot of what it has to be done at the local level and playing to local strengths. And I think that's really, really important. So what I want to do is just give you a bit of context of what I do and how myself and decarbonisation fits within the department, some of the things we're thinking about at the moment, some of the unknowns we have, and finally go on and have a think about what decarbonisation agenda looks like in the COVID recovery world. Being CSA, my role is to lead on technology, science innovation across the department, and make sure the department has the best science advice and evidence to make their decisions, make their policies, and also where they're commissioning R&D or other things, they really are looking for the most appropriate and most leading edge stuff that they can. And that's really, really important to all departments at the moment, particularly in the context that there is an ambition that by 2027, 2.4% of GDP will be spent on R&D across the UK, not just from government. And at the moment, it's just under 1.7, so a long way to go, but it gives us the real opportunities. And science is at the top of the agenda for all sorts of reasons, including the emergency we're in at the moment. When I came into the role, one of the things I was really concerned about was the lack of any engagement and relationship with the main research funders, which were all covered within UKRI. So spent a lot of time developing those relationships into very, very good functional things, and that's beginning to show some really, really good benefits for transport and for energy and for decarbonisation, which I'll come on to later. These are the sort of things I do, covering every area of science in the department, from decarbonisation to big data to trying to drag the railways into the 20th century, then maybe hopefully one day into the 21st, spaceflight, and more recently the whole issue around the COVID emergency, and now moving towards the COVID, well, that shouldn't say research and recovery, that should say restart and recovery phases. And I think I'd like to end this presentation by talking about some of my thoughts around that and some of the challenges we have. And one of the things that's really, really important is trying to join up across transport. Because if you look at the Department for Transport and you look at how a lot of transport is organised in the country, it's organised by mode. And as we know, for decarbonisation, we need to make sure that things are joined up better. So we're joining up the modes. The term I use to the ministers is desilification. It's quite gratifying that, although it's a horrible word, they're starting to use it themselves as well. Because if we don't join up across transport, we don't understand the flows of people and goods across modes and the reasons people travel, we can't influence that and make sure they're more likely to use more sustainable modes of travel, if indeed they still need to travel. And I think that's a really, really important part of what we do. So we have a data strategy team in the department looking at how the digital connectivity and the data across transport can be joined up better. And you'll probably see from the 5 o'clock briefings given by ministers on COVID that the first slide they always use is a slide bringing together info we gather on all the transport modes and their usage at this point in time. And that's hugely useful in that context and understanding the levels of social distancing, the levels of travel, and therefore the risk of people passing on the virus. So that whole data and digital connectivity to join up transport is really important, and really, really important for decarbonisation. Just before the lockdown, we had a Science Advisory Council deep dive on the opportunities for demand management in the 21st century using new technologies and techniques and new understanding as a key part of decarbonisation. Because one thing that's really important for the department to understand is it's not just technical solutions, there's social, behavioural, getting people to do things differently, redesigning how we do a lot of what we do in society and as an individual to really achieve the fundamental changes we need to reach a net zero in transport and in the UK by 2050. But there's a lot of technology out there, some very much supporting the decarbonisation agenda, others yet to support it, but moving that way. And we'll come on to some of that later. But the technology is really important in considering what we can do for decarbonisation, understanding what new modes are coming, how that changes how we move goods, how we move people, how automation, what role that may play in decarbonisation, because a lot of the automated vehicles are most likely to be electric anyway. Shared mobility, trying to understand the opportunity for that in getting people to move away from owning cars and move to more shared modes. That's going to be a real challenge in our COVID recovery world, because we've been telling people for 3 months now to avoid contact, social distance 2 meters, don't use public transport, and eventually we want people to move away from that and use public transport. So I think there's a big challenge there. Um, getting the timing right for all this is really, really important, and I think with the public mood over the last few years for decarbonisation and the concerns about climate change, now's the time to move quickly, and certainly within government. You know, along with the COVID restart and recovery, decarbonisation, moving to net zero, and the levelling up agenda are the key things that are focusing government's mind now and in the future. So there's a real opportunity for us. To help with the department using better, using science better, using R&D better, we've developed a science plan for the department, which really coordinates all the R&D across the department. It has to be signed off, has to be coordinated, and a lot of that R&D that's coming up is in the decarbonisation space in one way or another, and I'll come on to some of that later. But there was a review by Go Science in the Treasury last year, which was looking at science capability review for government. And one of the things there was, you know, let's make sure every department has a science plan, has a science system in place, so it becomes more prominent in the department to engage with all the policy teams, provide them with the resources and the support they need. So we really are using the leading edge science, the leading edge science evidence and supporting an R&D ecosystem to meet our objectives. And that's beginning to work really, really well, and you'll see that pay dividends over the next couple of years. Within the department, we have sort of 5 key enablers of what the department's about, what the department's going to deliver. The first 3, going left to right, are key sort of policy areas like making transport better for the user, the decarbonisation of transport, and levelling up the economy. And then the other 2 are more the sort of how do we make the department better? How do we make sure that the department is the best department in Whitehall and delivering well both nationally and internationally? So that's increasing global impact and making us an excellent department. And underneath that, it's underpinned by the science, the evaluation, the behaviour data, the security resilience, and all the other things that are sort of horizontal cross-cutting things in the department. So that's the sort of environment we're working in, and you know, there's a real ambition that we will have a green restart to the economy post-COVID, well, not post-COVID, but in recovering COVID. So that decarbonisation, the use of green tech and green recovery, moving towards net zero is a key part of what we need to do. And the reason it's so important in transport, as you all know, that where most of the modes, most of the sectors of society have decarbonised quite well, transport's the one that it's been very, very hard to do so. And that's not because vehicles haven't become less. They're using more carbon. In some cases, they are with the SUVs and the like. But it's really because there's a lot more transport than there was in 1990 as well. So we've got probably the biggest challenge within government. We've got about 33% of the domestic greenhouse gas comes from transport, and the majority of that comes from road transport. That doesn't include international aviation, that doesn't include international shipping, although that now is being brought into the calculations based on the recommendations of the Committee for Climate Change. We've produced a whole range of publications on decarbonisation for different areas. So we've got the Maritime 2050, we've got the last mile, we've got the role that future mobility plays in decarbonisation, we've got the road to zero for electric vehicles, and there's an awful lot going on in that sector. And we've now formed a carbon board in the department to coordinate all that internally, to make sure that we're joined up and using the same measures to go forward. And we also have the other key departments in that impact on the decisions we make, and that in particular BEIS from both the industrial strategy, but also from the energy. They control the energy system, and therefore if we make decisions on changing the energy vectors we're going to use within transport to decarbonize them, we've got to make sure that that can indeed be achieved with the energy in the quantities we need being available, being green, and being where we need it. And that's a challenge, which again I'll touch on a little bit later. We announced that we had a plan to produce a decarbonisation plan in October of last year, and that really just set up a very broad roadmap of what we wanted to do, but really galvanise government and the arm's length bodies to move forward. And that was followed in March of this year by the Decarbonising Transport, and this was really setting the challenge. This is quite a detailed document, still at quite a high level, but saying all the things we need to do. And what was really important, and really quite significant, science and the engagement, UKRI and academia and research was mentioned very strongly in there, showing that we don't know all the answers to this. We need to make sure that we work with our academic partners like DecarboN8 and the like to help us deliver on this. It also recognised, I think this is really, really important, and Greg touched on this at the beginning in terms of the role of DecarboN8 as well. It's looking at place-based solutions. We know some stuff has to be national, but you've got to play to regional strengths as well. And I think that's really, really important. And you'll hear that term used more and more and more, both in terms of decarbonisation, but also in terms of that levelling up agenda as well. So in setting the challenge, we're looking at place-based solutions. We're looking at accelerating modal shift to public and active transport. One has gone very well in the COVID emergency, that move towards active transport. The other is going to be more challenging coming out of the COVID emergency into recovery. We clearly recognise we need to decarbonise road vehicles. There is also a recognition that we need to reduce the number of road vehicles emitting, and so there's a challenge around that as well. And again, part of the post-COVID recovery is seeing what good practice can be locked in that we've been using for 3 months now to communicate with each other and have these sort of meetings using remote comms more. Decarbonising of goods is really significant as well. And a lot of people have questioned why are there still quite a lot of flights coming into the UK during the COVID crisis. Some are carrying passengers, but the majority are still flying because a lot of high value and perishable goods still come by aviation. So there's a challenge to address there as well. The Decarbonisation Plan, when it was launched in March, got some really good press. It was seen as a proper visionary document. Even our colleagues from other government departments, particularly based, said, wow, that is pretty awesome. That really helps us understand the challenge we have for energy, the challenge we have for the industrial strategy and the like. So I think we're all moving in the right direction, although I would say there's an awful long way to go. And the scale of the challenge is massive when you think about what we're trying to achieve with our different carbon budgets. We've got a long way to go with CB4 and 5, and it can't be just small incremental changes. Certain fundamental decisions have to be made about how different sectors are going to decarbonize, how we're going to do other things to take carbon out of the air and out of the environment in different ways, that's a real challenge. But let's actually have a think about that from the transport side. And I keep on mentioning BEIS and energy, and it's critically important because the scale of the challenge, if we're transiting from using fossil fuels into other means of powering our transport networks, that's going to have a fundamental change on how we do energy as well. If you look at this diagram, it's produced by Grant Wilson at Birmingham. It's hugely helpful. He sent me an updated version, but I just couldn't find it. So this one only goes to 2017. But basically, the blue line that's quite cyclic is the use of gas on an annual basis. As you see, it peaks in the winter and reduces in the summer because it's used for heating a lot, obviously. The red line is the demand for electricity over the year, and very mildly cyclic. Yeah, there's a slightly less demand in the summer because we're a country that doesn't need so much air conditioning as others, and a slight increase in the winter. But if you then look at the grey line, which is the step line, that's the amount of transport fuel that's used in the country at the moment. So that's aviation fuel, diesel, petrol, etc. And if you think that if we're going to decarbonize and get away from using those sort of fuels, all that energy there, topping above 1500 gigawatt hours has to become electricity or some other mechanism for use. So a massive scale change in what's needed. And clearly the challenge to do that through renewables is massive. It's happening, but there's a long way to go. So got to think about the energy system and not just about what we use to power the vehicles and what we do to change how people travel and indeed when they travel so much. And this is critical to trying to get the balance between the two. And I can't emphasize that enough. So part of what we're doing at the moment as part of this delivering on the Transport Decarbonisation Plan is a lot of stakeholder engagement that will be happening. They're setting up a Net Zero Transport Council to oversee that. It'll have the great and the good on to really be an external challenge to us. And I think that's really, really important. There's also a Net Zero Innovation Board, which until last week had been called the Energy Innovation Board, which is trying to coordinate all the energy thinking across government to make sure we understand what sectors are looking at different fuels and how much demand there's going to be on the actual energy networks themselves. You know, what sectors are going to use hydrogen, what sectors might want to use synthetic fuels, and what does all that mean? And the research councils and UKRI very much engage with that to work out where their new programs need to be to again support that whole agenda. Within transport, we do a lot of this through the Transport Research and Innovation Board. This was one of the structures I set up when I came in as CSA a few years ago, and it really brings together most of the arm's length bodies and key transport providers in the UK across the modes, along with the research funders such as Innovate UK, ESRC, EPSRC, and also UKRI separately. And feeding into that is the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, which I've mentioned, the DFT Science Plan, which I introduced you to before, and also the actual priorities from the different bodies. So what are the priorities for HS2, for Network Rail, for Highways England, the Aerospace Technology Institute, for ADEP, which is the grouping of directors of environment and transport in local authorities. They're all parts of TRIB to make sure that we're capturing everything that we think forms part of the decarbonisation challenge. In parallel with that, we've been funding some work on a decarbonisation roadmap, R&D roadmap, which MOTS has been doing for us, and I'll tell you a little bit about that later. And coming out of that is trying to identify where there are knowledge gaps and research gaps, so we can discuss with research the funders and with the bodies there who also have research money in many cases to fund research in those areas. And that helped influence a couple of years ago the whole Network Plus that DecarboN8 is part of. And we're looking at a key program with UKRI and DFT joint program on decarbonisation, which is almost oven ready and ready to be considered for funding, and feeding into other structures like the infrastructure group in TRIB that's looking at decarbonising infrastructure, which is often forgotten but is a major part of the carbon budget in the UK. And we're pretty good at coming up with materials that can replace the carbon intensive concrete and steel, etc., but needs more coordination. And the Net Zero Innovation Board, which I mentioned earlier, which is coordinating decarbonisation across the energy sector, and that's led out of BEIS. I mentioned this roadmap. This will form part of what is published later this year on decarbonisation when we come up with the full plan. And what the roadmap's done is looked at different energy vectors and what decisions have to be made at different points in time to make sure that government and particularly DFT in the transport sector can deliver on that. So the roadmaps on the left-hand side look really, really complicated, but basically they've got little decision points in there where if we don't make a decision on this or that or the other, we may be up behind the curve in delivering on decarbonisation. And the key things we're looking at are hydrogen and its variants, so either hydrogen direct or in fuels such as liquids such as ethanol or ammonia, battery electric solutions, which is a key part of it, route electrification, maybe looking at catenaries or inductive charging under the road, for example, and then other fuels, biofuels and synthetic fuels, and what role they will play. And so that's going to be published this summer. There's been a couple of meetings on that recently, and I know a number of people on the call have attended those. And then we try to map this, how this fits into the Energy Innovation Board, which is now the Net Zero Board. So they have a whole raft of technologies they're looking at, including carbon capture and storage, which I think is very, very important, particularly if hydrogen is going to be produced through steam methane reforming, looking at bioenergy and greenhouse gas, direct removal of greenhouse gases, and also SMRs, looking at small modular reactors that could potentially create green electricity, and as a side impact of that, generate hydrogen as well. So hydrogen transport demand is part of that crossover to what Bayes is thinking: sustainable fuels for jets, to try and move the aviation industry towards near to net zero, and batteries, charging, autonomy, and that whole future of transport side. And all those things there will be covered within the UK RI DFT decarbonisation program, which will emerge over the summer as well. This has highlighted an issue which I think is important, and that is the modal opportunities for hydrogen. Hydrogen's really been on the back burner for a long time. We've looked at hydrogen in transport on a number of occasions, but we've always looked at it in isolation. So the economic cost and the carbon budgets have tended not to stack up. But now we're seeing that other sectors are really keen on hydrogen, for high intensity manufacturing that needs heat, such as steel making, possibly the decarbonisation of homes, where you pump hydrogen into the homes rather than natural gas. And so the whole basis of what hydrogen could be available has really changed. And although it's still a Marmite topic within the department, where some people are very much feel that it's a technology too far, and we can do most things with electrification alone, I actually believe we need to really investigate hydrogen more, and do that very quickly. I think some heavy goods vehicles, particularly buses and HGVs, may benefit from hydrogen if the battery use cycle doesn't enable them to do what they want. And also bear in mind, you're sticking several tons of batteries onto an HGV to run it on electric. Is that an efficient way of doing it, both in terms of the dead weight you're carrying around, and if we have limited stocks of lithium and cobalt for batteries, would they much be better off focused on smaller modes such as cars and vans, because that's where batteries clearly deliver well. So there's no decisions made, but we are beginning to look at this much more seriously. Obviously, there's some demonstrations of rail with hydrogen. There's an opportunity to explore where other hydrogen rail projects could potentially happen. And Network Rail is currently doing a study on looking at the opportunities for propulsion on all the non-electrified rail lines in the UK. So should those lines be electrified? Could they run on hydrogen? Could they run on only battery? Could they run on some hybrid solution? And what on earth do we do about freight, which needs really high torque energy, which very difficult to replace diesel at the moment? So big challenges there. In maritime, it's clearer. I think the UK Maritime have decided that hydrogen, either directly or through ammonia, is probably the way forward. And what I'd like to see, but again, this is not policy at the moment, I'd love to see some hydrogen hubs appear, which show multimodal transport provision, where you may be powering some hydrogen lorries and buses, as well as trains and maritime at ports. And I think if that could show that we can make hydrogen work, that would be great. The big challenge is we don't know what the cost of hydrogen will be at scale. We need to be sure that it is actually green, so being used, converted from green electricity through electrolysis. We know electrolysis is very expensive at the moment, and the efficiency isn't very good. My challenge to researchers, my challenge to the industry is, can you tell me that if we had to have a lot of hydrogen, so you start innovating and delivering for the market, what will be the cost reductions? What will be the scale that can be achieved, and can we keep it green? Obviously, one of the other key areas of decarbonisation is electrification of many of the modes. And that obviously requires a leap of faith that in the longer term we will have a lot of green electricity, and I think that's beginning to happen. So that's good. We also recognise that electrification doesn't just help with decarbonisation and dealing with negatives of climate change, but it also provides a much better environment because it also reduces poor air quality and noise as well. So lots of opportunities there. Lots of funding has been done through OLEV, Office of Low Emission Vehicles, which is a joint organisation between BEIS, which looks at the industrial opportunities of electric vehicles, and DFT, that's looking at what are the challenges of getting an electric transport economy on the roads. And they've had some great successes, but they've now got a real challenge to move forward if we're trying to really get most new vehicles ultra low emission, which probably means electric for small vehicles at least, by those purchased by 2035 to be electric. So there's a massive piece of work to do there, and this is why I think we need to also look at other alternatives, of which hydrogen and biosynthetic fuels may well form part of the mix for some of the other vehicles. We've got to make sure there's an adequate supply. Clearly, coming out of COVID, I think a number of car manufacturers would love to go back to type and just produce volumes and volumes of diesel cars to sell. Whereas I think the opportunity must be, let's try and accelerate the adoption of electric vehicles. We've got to make sure that consumers understand electric vehicles. Many people have never been in one. Many people still have a perception that they're not as performant as other vehicles. Many people worry about the range of electric vehicles, rightly so, but that is beginning to change. And also you find once people use an electric vehicle, they understand how to use it, and that range anxiety for many of them go away, not completely as of yet. And obviously we need an infrastructure fit for purposes. And this is where one of the real challenges is, because it's almost a chicken and egg situation. You need the infrastructure in there to give people the confidence to buy the electric vehicles, even though at the moment there aren't that many people with electric vehicles. Therefore, the infrastructure doesn't stack up in many cases from a business case. So it's a real challenge, and this is where government have to step in, where the market's not quite there yet, to make sure that the supply is there. And also, I think really importantly, working out strategically where electric vehicle charging should take place. In the original funding of infrastructure, for example, the plugged in places funding 8 or 9 years ago, the charging posts were put in almost anywhere where local authorities and others would had a space, rather than in strategic locations where they'd really get well used. And I think we need to make sure that's addressed, and certainly indeed it is. And the secondly is what sort of electric vehicle charging. We've got slow charges, which are 3 or 7 kilowatt hour, the sort of thing that you saw in the first generation of chargers, and the sort of thing you would have at home. And then you've got these rapid chargers at 30k, 50k, and even over 100k now, which can recharge an electric vehicle up to about 80% of the battery from empty in less than half an hour. And it's understanding what mix is required, how people will use them, and how much people are willing to pay for them. And also, if you put a lot of electric vehicle charging at home, which seems logical if you're parking your car at home overnight, what impact does that have on the local network? Does that need reinforcing? And there's a massive cost associated with that. Or even if everybody is charging at night, the big questions are, do we need to do some demand management to influence people to charge at different times? They're not all trying to take electricity at the same time. Lots of investment has gone into this, and will continue to do so. It is seen as one of the key pillars of the transport decarbonisation policy. It's also seen as one of the key pillars of the industrial society. We funded big industrial strategy challenge fund projects like Driving the Electric Revolution. So the power electronics and the electric drives that are needed for electric vehicles, the research and the production of those can be done in the UK. And we funded things like the Faraday Centre to look at next generation battery technology. and also looking towards building a gigafactory for batteries in the UK. So the UK has a real stake in electromobility, and I think the whole consideration at the moment, that in terms of what we saw during the COVID crisis and certain components and raw materials not becoming available, is that there is a real appetite to try and onshore some of this and make sure the UK has more capability in this area. So things like Durr and Faraday that started before then were really, they were really ahead of the thinking, and credit to BEIS for what they've done there. Okay, so they're the sort of things we're thinking about. I just want to throw a couple of other things in. We're moving out the emergency phase with COVID now into what's known as restart and recovery, and for transport, that's a real challenge, because we're trying to run transport services with social distancing, which means in public transport you can probably only deliver 25% of the capacity you did before. But what that means also, because it's hit aviation, maritime, and road freight hard, is I suspect those industries are going to have less money and less appetite to decarbonize, because the economics have changed. So I think it's really, really important that as researchers and innovators, we look at innovative solutions to help those sectors move forward. They all want to, but there's an economic reality which has really impacted on them. So there's some challenges there, and government's looking at what we need to do to work with these industries to move forward. There's a real concern, at least in the short term, that car use will increase. We've been telling people for 3 months not to social distance, not to go in big groups of people you don't know, and more recently, try and avoid public transport if you can, because the capacity it can deliver is low. So I think we're going to see in the short term an increase in the use of personal vehicles for going to work and doing other things. We've got to look at what do we do in the long term to bring people back to more sustainable forms of transport. Is there an opportunity, whilst not a lot of people are using public transport, to really think about redesigning, rebranding, reconsidering the whole transport, the public transport offer, so it is really a much better decarbonised offer, and also delivering up on the levelling economy when it does come back. Is this a real opportunity also to bring in more battery electric buses, hydrogen buses, and really encourage the decarbonisation of the modes? And if we don't do that, bear in mind, people are still buying diesel trains at this point in time. Those trains are going to be an asset being used for 30, 40 years. Same with buses, 15, 20 years, same with HGVs. So the sooner we can push this agenda, the better. What has been really, really encouraging during the COVID crisis is the increase in cycling and the increase in walking. And again, the challenge is we've got to try and lock down that good practice and keep it. Really, really encouraged that many cities have shut a number of roads and open them up to cycling and walking, so people can stay social distance while doing that. There's health benefits, there's emission benefits, air quality benefits around that. We need to try and lock that in. And obviously also, because there haven't been that many cars around, the air quality has significantly improved in many cities. And I think citizens have recognized that, politicians have recognized that. And what can we do to try and keep that and try and lock that in? Are there changes could be made potentially to the clean air zones to readjust what they can do, what they're allowed to do based on this post-COVID world, or sorry, COVID recovery world? I'm not that optimistic about post-COVID at this point in time. Obviously, we're all working remotely. How can some of that good practice be locked in so the demand for travel, particularly at the peak, particularly heading into cities, is reduced to some extent? We don't want it to stop, because it will kill cities if no one's in the offices at all. But we can certainly see a significant reduction. I imagine there's a lot of you on the call, particularly academics, who go away to lots of meaningless conferences around the world, and you're probably thinking, I'm not really missing those. I miss some of the mates that I meet there and discussion, but did I really need to go to several of those a year in far-flung parts of the world by air to talk about decarbonisation? There's got to be a rethink. And just to say, decarbonisation is a big part of what we're doing along with recovery, but we're thinking about lots of other stuff as well. We're looking at aviation and the unique challenges there, particularly things like electric aviation. We're looking at new forms of propulsion. We're looking at trying to make our infrastructure smarter. So we have a whole future stream operating in the department as well, which is always looking at it from a decarb and a COVID recovery lens. And the scenario has been produced about, if COVID goes like this or goes like that or whatever, what could transport look like in 6, 24 and months and 15 years. Excuse me. And it's really important to think about that and prepare. And although scenarios are just plausible potential futures, they're not the future. It helps us really challenge ourselves to make sure that we're thinking in the right way. And we need that engagement with academia to do that. We certainly don't know everything we need to know ourselves. Still considering new transport modes. And I think, although I didn't put it on here because I think micromobility is really going to come to the fore. It seems to be very popular within government as a way of enabling people to move a bit further than they could with walking. So looking at opportunities and regulations for electric scooters, which at this point in time are not technically legal to use on the road or the paths, and also big support for electric bikes to give people the opportunity to travel out a little bit further. These are healthy or semi-healthy options at least, and I think we need to look at how we incorporate that more into the DNA of our city planning and our transport offerings. And that's a sort of an overview of some of the things we're thinking. The challenges are big. They're not just transport, they really are the energy system, but it's also trying to consider what sort of society we want so we can deliver on decarbonisation and net zero. It will mean, doing things differently to some extent, but we've been doing things differently for the last 3 months, and humans and businesses are incredibly adaptive, and we just got to decide what adaptations do we want to consider and encourage and nudge people to do. And I'll finish there. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Phil. And the chat function has been filling up with lots and lots of different questions. So we really are going to stress test your knowledge of the whole Department for Transport agenda and beyond that as well.